once again, welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, the Little Five and the Ugly Five, presented by Richard de Gouveia and Matt Meyer. As most of you all know, these gentlemen need no introduction whatsoever. They have entertained us now for over a year with the greatest stories of Southern Africa. So I'm just going to hand it over to them. Matt, off to you.
Thanks, Ted. Thanks, everyone, for coming tonight or today in the States and joining in for another one of our fireside chats. As everyone knows who's come on a safari, I mean, obviously the megafauna is the big attraction for the majority of our travelers who come to Africa. The lion, the leopard, the elephant, buffalo, rhino, and everything else that follows on that. But for people that come back or for other people that might not necessarily be interested in them, there obviously are a lot more, and there is a lot more to a safari in Africa than just the big things. And the good looking things as well. And so today, what Rich and I thought we should focus on is some of the smaller things, and then some of the, let's call it, quirkier looking things. And so we're going to start off today with the Little Five. And essentially, the Little Five get their namesake following on the Big Five. So I'm going to hand over to Rich, who's going to give us an introduction to a few of the animals that are in the Little Five.
What's up, guys? Thanks so much for joining us. And again, we're going to get into a little bit of the Little Five and getting away from the big stuff. Let's start going into what us as guides like to try and entertain people with in between the megafauna sightings that Matt was talking about. So these guys were all named the Little Five because for their namesake. So we have the antlion, the elephant shrew, the buffalo weaver, the rhino beetle, and the leopard tortoise. And these strange little creatures all are very small or indifferent, and we're going to shed a bit of light on them. So I'm going to start today off with the antlion. Now, you guys in the States might know them as a doodlebug, called a doodlebug because of the strange doodle marks that they make in the sand as they move between their conical little nests that they build. This is an antlion over here, this crazy looking creature, massive mandibles for grabbing onto and holding prey. They have little slits inside there that inject venom into anything that falls into these conical shaped traps that they build, and they also ingest or inject the enzymes to break down the animal and then start to feed. Now, the wingspan of an animal can get of the adult form of this, which is a lacewing or an antlion lacewing, which is this, can get to around 6 inches. It is massive compared to what is normally an animal that is no bigger than a 1/4 inch, maybe 1/2 inch at best when they're in their larval phase. Now, these adults are generally nocturnal. They're often thought of as potentially a dragonfly or something, or a damselfly, but they're actually a completely different type of animal. Now, they're among an animal that in their larval form, this is their larval form here, they have no anus. So everything they eat remains inside them until such time as they start to pupate. Now, they'll use what is inside them to, one, create the cocoon that you can see here, as it pupates and metamorphizes into the adult form. And then as it pupates, it will actually give off a meconium. So for Matt, who's just had a baby, the first poo or that first going to the toilet of a baby is called a meconium, and that's where they get rid of it. So thanks, no problems, Matt. And you're still in the nappy phase. You know, if your baby was an antlion, you wouldn't change the nappy. But it's a fascinating thing because the way they feed and the places that they live, which is often dry areas, they don't know how often an ant's going to fall in there. So their growth and their change to get to this cocoon stage and change to an adult varies from individual to individual. The more they eat, the faster they get to the point that they can metamorphose and change into the adult. But at some stages, they can go months without eating, and this larval form can take several years before they change into the cocoon. So how they do this is they create a conical shape, this little sand pit, and they use these jaws to flick the sand out. And the conical pits actually have a gradually steeper sloping sides as it gets to the middle. All that protrudes are these little mandibles of these guys. And as soon as this guy slips inside, it then bites it, and it will throw sand above it to keep it falling further down until it can bite it, inject it, and keep it going. So for a crazy little creature, that is an antlion. So let's move on to an elephant shrew, Matt.
So one of the things that I was actually, and Rich and I were talking about this prior to today with Ted as well. One of the coolest things about these webinars has been, and Rich is sitting there laughing at this picture. I saw it, I could not put it, because that's what brings comes to my mind when I hear elephant shrew. It's this little tiny shrew with a nose like an elephant. But this might be, and I know this might be, and I know we say this often, but this might be my new favorite creature on safari. And unfortunately, we don't get to see them very often because they are very secretive and elusive creatures. But the elephant shrews are found across the continent of Africa. There are about 18 species or so, the 18, 19 species or so of elephant shrew. The largest, which is the gray-faced elephant shrew, was only discovered in 2005, and so they're still expanding. And so with a lot of your sort of rodents, especially the ones that live out in the desert areas that aren't commonly researched, they're still discovering new species. So at the moment, we're sitting at about 18 species of elephant shrew, or sengi as they're called in East Africa. It's the Swahili name. The smallest one is this little guy. Rich, if you just want to zoom out quickly, the little one, I think it's the bottom right-hand corner, is the short-eared elephant shrew. So down there, they weigh in at about 1 to 1.5 ounces, so like 25 to 45 grams, and they're about 4 inches long, so only 10 or so centimeters long. They live in a sandy habitat, and one of the cool things about them is that they've got a series of trails, much like a park trail or a trail running trail network, between various feeding areas in their territory that they will maintain. So they'll walk along and they'll flick any debris out of that so that they can quickly escape at up to 28 kilometers an hour, so 17 miles an hour. They can escape predators. Now, these guys will have this network of trails in a territory or in a home range of up to 240 acres. That's 90 odd hectares for a creature that's this big. It's mind-blowing how much these guys move around. Now they are what are known as sort of leaf litter invertebrate eaters. So they eat termites and ants, etc. But then they also eat small shoots off of any plants. So that small little animal has a 56-day gestation, so a 2-month gestation. They're born, they give birth to up to 2 precocial young. So precocial, essentially before birth, cocial development. So precocial, they're almost fully developed, they come running out, and they are sexually mature after 6 weeks. 6 weeks, they're sexually mature. They can have, I don't even know what a young elephant shrew is. I mean, maybe it's a pup. They can have pups after 6 weeks and have up to 5 litters a year, and they live up to 2 to 4 years old. Now, I mean, that's a turbo life if I've ever sort of heard of one. And the majority of them are diurnal. So they're not nocturnal like a lot of other smaller rodents, like your gerbils and your field mice, which are typically nocturnal. These guys are diurnal. Now, the biggest of them, which is that the gray-faced elephant shrew, which is found in Tanzania, only again discovered in 2005. This guy on the other side of the spectrum, he weighs almost 2 pounds. And he can get up to sort of 1.5 feet long. And these guys will live, they also live in sort of more forested areas. They live in the bottom of leaflets, so they push a bunch of stuff together, almost like a mound, and they'll live inside of that. But the group as a whole, elephant shrews, they're not actually shrews. And they are, in fact, closer related to, distant related, much like the hyraxes, to pachyderms. So closer related to elephants, manatees, etc., than they are to shrews themselves. And another funny thing about them is that they don't tolerate their neighbors. So if they are cruising around their territory and there's an intruder, they'll actually aggressively fight this intruder. Now, if you can imagine a 4-inch long shrew that can run at 28 kilometers or 17 miles per hour, having a battle royale with another one, I mean, that's just going to be, it's just going to be chaos with a bunch of sand flying everywhere. And then they also scent mark their territory. So they've got a very scaly tail, which will, they excrete a scent from an anal gland that then sticks to their tail, and everywhere they walk, it's essentially like sandpaper that's rubbing along all of the debris as they walk along. So elephant shrews, yeah, my new, and that's going to be something that I'm going to be looking for. My guests are going to be looking in the trees for leopards, and I'm going to be scanning the underbrush for elephant shrews from now on, I think.
I like it. I like it. The next culprit in our little five is a bird called a buffalo weaver. Now, East Africa, there's a white-headed buffalo weaver, and in Southern Africa, we have a red-billed buffalo weaver. And these red-billed buffalo weavers build very messy nests, which have a numerous amounts of chambers within it. And I mean, birds are birds. And as we go into this stuff, the little stuff, it's not like he's doing extremely interesting stuff catching insects. But the one thing that permeates the whole of nature is to survive long enough to breed. What Matt was telling me earlier is those elephant shrews in a lifetime can have up to 40 babies in a lifetime. So it's about churning out the babies to make sure your genetics survive. Now, these guys have a very interesting way of doing this, and often our talk comes back to sexual interaction. Now, the red-billed buffalo weaver has a fake penis. It has no carrying of sperm or any penetration that happens within the lady or anything like that. It is literally a piece of tissue that gets blood flow and becomes erect. It's kind of weird. And scientists for a long time saw it, but didn't know what position it played in the whole thing. So as scientists go, and this is why we became guides and not scientists, is one guy had to try and figure it out. So they put dummies up to see what the buffalo weaver was doing and put him there and try and see what the dummy, what's happening, and nothing was telling the guy what was happening. So eventually the scientists grabbed the bird and started rubbing. Now their sexual act lasts 30 minutes. Now for a bird, that is crazy. If you've ever watched a bird mate, it hops on and it hops off. If it even takes that long. These guys go for 30 minutes, it blows my brain. And effectively what he is doing is he is getting excited with this phallic piece of tissue, and it causes an orgasm after 30 minutes. Yes, a bird has an orgasm. And what they found with research is the buffalo weavers with bigger, useless pieces of tissue actually get more ladies and have bigger territories than ones with smaller ones. They're generally found within communities where the guys with smaller phallic pieces are actually alone on their own. So yeah, wrap your head around that one. Matt,
it's funny because I mean we did a webinar a couple of months ago on birds, and we were going through which species to talk about, and Rich said, I want to do the buffalo weaver. And then we were going over which species we were talking about for the little five, and Rich said, I want to do the buffalo weaver. So I'm trying to figure out how we're going to be able to weave a buffalo weaver into another webinar so that you can go, I want to talk about a buffalo weaver. Because I said, I want to talk about a rhino beetle, because as everyone who's spent more than about 30 seconds with me knows that rhinos are my passion. I love them. And so anything that is even remotely linked to a rhino, it has my attention. So rhino beetles, we've got about 300 species of rhino beetles across the world, about 60 of which occur in Africa. Now, the biggest of those is actually the largest beetle in the world. They can get up to about 6 inches, so a 6-inch beetle. And the smallest of, or the largest of which in Africa is about a 2-inch rhino beetle, which is the one at the bottom right there on that Leopard Tortoise, which is found in northern KwaZulu-Natal, which is in eastern South Africa, around where I grew up. Now, they, unlike a lot of other beetles, they do not fly. So rhino beetles typically don't fly. They've got the wings, they've got the thorax protection with the secondary wings essentially, but they don't fly. And that is for that increased weight in the head. If you can imagine, it would be like a bird that's used to flying with very long tail feathers. If those tail feathers weren't there, they would just kind of head plant going forward. So they would take off and fall forward. Now, rhino beetles use these extensions on their head for fighting amongst males. Now, the top right or top left-hand picture there, you can see that's a male on the left-hand side and a female on the right-hand side. The females still have these protrusions of their head, the horns, but they don't play an active part in their life, and so they're slightly smaller. Whereas the males, that's obviously the larger, the genes for the larger horn will then progress beyond the genes for the smaller horn, and those will be the males that will gain preference with the females. So these guys, not only the largest beetle in the world, but also family of the strongest beetles in the world. They possess the capacity and ability to lift almost 850 times their own weight. An elephant, if forced to do so, might be able to lift 25 times, or at least leverage 25 times of their own weight in terms of strength. So the tensile strength, let's say the tensile strength of a marula tree has the breaking strength of 25,000 pounds. An elephant can push that and break that. If that was in relation to a rhino beetle, that would then be 40 times more what an elephant can. So 850 times their own weight. They have the capability of pushing, lifting, or moving that. So the strongest of all of the beetles, and beetles are the strongest, I mean, invertebrates are the strongest of all of the groups of animals in the world. Now, these guys have a lifespan of 2 to 5 years, and they are dung rollers, not your typical dung beetles where they create these big balls, roll them, bury them, etc. But they are dung rollers where they will lay their egg inside dung and push a little bit, which will then be buried. And that's where the larvae will metamorphose and come out. And then, final note with them, unlike black rhinos, my spirit animal, who when they sense danger, they run straight for it or straight away from it in any direction, but as madly as they can. Rhino beetles, when they sense danger and when they sense prey, they're like an ostrich. They bury themselves. So they just go and they dig. And they dig under and they sit there and they wait for it to go away. They don't attack it. They don't run from it. They just bury it. Oh,
that's
hilarious.
Funny, man. That's crazy. I didn't expect that they would live 2 to 5 years. One thing I forgot to mention with the antlion is they can live mainly for about 25 days. You know, very different lifespans.
Well, I mean, look at that. That's a beetle that lives the same amount of time as the shrew.
Yeah.
So they have a very similar life cycle, or a very similar lifespan, but completely different life cycles. A rhino beetle might have one breed or one season of breeding in it, and then it dies. So essentially, it's duplicating its genes once. Whereas, as you said, if an elephant shrew can have up to 2 offspring in one litter and 5 a year and live for 4 years, you're looking at the potential offspring, because they have a pretty high or pretty low infant mortality, but you have a potential offspring of 4 in the same time that a rhino beetle will have 1.
Yeah, exactly.
Incredible.
Exactly. Unbelievable. Now let's go on to something that lives a little longer than those guys. This is the leopard tortoise. These guys, in exceptional cases, can reach over 90 pounds. I mean, that's quite a large animal that's moving around. Now, they often have very serious tick infestations around the head and neck because they can't get it. There's no way to groom. And the females grow faster than the males, specifically to get their genetics ready so that they can mate and start having these little ones. And what's fascinating is that in dry areas, the shell of the tortoise itself will actually weigh less than those in wetter areas. So they just have to carry around less weight. And because of these shells and good lung capacity and the air above the top, so the gap between the top of the body and the shell is quite large, which adds insulation so they can survive incredible heat, but it also allows them to float so that they can swim and swim slowly and move along. So mating is a very important part of their lives, as we've come to understand, and males will fight. They'll become very combative over the idea of mating. And what they do is they will actually start ramming each other, headbutting each other, and sometimes actually overturning the other animal in order to get to the lady. Now, once he's won that fight with the guy, the male now needs to pursue the female, and he subdues her through butting. So I think she just gets cross with him running into her the whole time. Now, the act of this whole situation, you would think that tortoise is quite quiet. But when they start this whole thing, there's a lot of grunting, groaning, hissing, biting. Whoa, it gets crazy. And the way you tell the difference between a male and a female is by turning them upside down. This is called the plastron, which is the bottom part of the shell. A female will have a square part, and the male has actually got a bit of a concave area, which allows him to be able to mount onto her shell and do what he needs to do. After that, they will lay about 24 eggs, and temperature of the soil in which they lay the eggs will determine the sex. Anything from 31 degrees centigrade to 34 degrees centigrade will result in females. Anything lower than that will result in males. And when they're born, these little shells are not hard like the adults. These are soft. They still need to get calcium. And what they will do is they will go onto one of our next contenders, which we'll talk about in the ugly 5, the hyena, and it will seek out its dung because of the calcium content within the dung. And these little guys will eat that dung in order to increase the calcium intake to harden that shell and form the protective covering around it. So that is our little 5. Now we are going to move on to the ugly 5. And I have chosen the picture there because my son has a book called The Ugly 5. And we are going to introduce everyone with this beautiful book. So let's start. I'm not going to do the singing part because then you'll all switch off. Morning had dawned on the African plain. The lion lay grooming his glorious mane. The kudu looked cool, the rhino looked fine, and the pink flamingos looked simply divine. The zebra looked graceful, the leopard looked great. Oh, what a picture of beauty! But wait, who is this creature so ugly and weird, with her spindly legs and her gingery beard, with her big chunky chest and her skinny behind? To say she looks plain would be really unkind. It's the wildebeest. So Matt, tell us a little bit about this crazy looking creature.
I was really hoping you were going to change your mind and start singing that, but hey, we can only hope. So wildebeest, named so actually by the Dutch who colonized southern Africa, sort of in the late 1500s, early 1600s, for its unkempt and very unruly manner. So it's an unkempt look, unruly manner, wildebeest, wild beast. But also often referred to as the canoe, which, like the Sengi, the Swahili name, the canoe stems from the Swahili name for wildebeest in East Africa, which is where they are most famously known for that mass migration. In southern Africa, the Zulus believe that the wildebeest was the last animal that was created by the creator. And that was because there was this, you know, when you're building a puzzle, when you take apart a piece of machinery and you put it all back together, and then you've got all these random parts lying around that you don't know where they go. And that's what happened with the wildebeest. The creator created all creatures equal, and everyone was roaming the plains, and he had this box of leftover parts, and he thought, let me just put them together and see what happens, and out popped the wildebeest. They've got the stripes of the zebra, they've got the horns of the buffalo, they've got the long drooping face of a donkey, and then they have a tail of a horse. So they were all put together with all of these pieces, and that's essentially what came out. But two species of wildebeest across Africa, so they occur from sort of equatorial Africa, from about just north of the equator in Kenya, all the way down to South Africa. The two species are the black and the blue wildebeest, also known as the brindled and the golden-tailed wildebeest, or the bearded wildebeest. And the most commonly, or the most well-known one, is the blue or the brindled wildebeest, which are all of the pictures here that we can see. They range in size from about 300 to 600 or so pounds. And let's just go and the best way to describe and to get to know wildebeest is for this huge spectacular spectacle of nature of the Great Migration, where you have got the simultaneous movement of about 2.5 million animals every year that go from the southern Serengeti all the way up into the Lamai Wedge and the Mara Triangle and back down, and kind of move in this counterclockwise, clockwise, figure of eight cyclical motion, whereby these wildebeest will follow the rains and follow the grass. Now they cast, so essentially they breed in the peak of rainy season, and they have about an 8 to 8.5 month gestation, where they then calf at the very beginning of the rainy season. So essentially, a female will breed this year, she'll calf the next, raise, and then breed the following year. So in about a 2-year life cycle of breeding. And essentially, this herd of about 2 million or so there's the big bulk herd, which does most of the migration. And then you've got various resident herds in these various parts of the Serengeti Mara ecosystem. Now, they will simultaneously drop calves within a 2 to 3 week period over January, February, depending on when the rains start. And that is a calving of about 400,000 to 500,000 calves. Now, that's just it's a figure that is, I mean, you go to there's no way to describe the migration. You have to go and witness it. Every person who comes to Africa at least once needs to witness this marvel of wildlife, where essentially, it was a volcanic eruption about 2 million years ago, laid ash in the southern Serengeti, made this incredibly fertile grassland where this herd of 1.5 million, 2 million wildebeest go every year, calve, allows their milk to be produced, give birth to these. I mean, this young wildebeest could be 5 minutes old and he's running almost the speed that his mother is. And then they move north, they move west, they follow the rain, they move north, all the way up into the western Serengeti, back around across the Mara River, down into the Mara Triangle, where it's famously known for those river crossings. And that is the most dangerous part of their migration, where they get funneled into these little ravines, and they've got to cross the river, where they've got some of Africa's biggest crocodiles laying in wait. And then it's the chaos and essentially the washing machine of these rivers, as you've got this clattering of hooves moving through, where animals will just get swept out below, and then the crocodiles have their take with whatever is left. Now, the breeding of these females, after about 4 months, the calves are weaned, and then they'll leave their mother at about 8 months old, when their mother will then be looking to mate again, and they'll form these little peer groups, and essentially that herd will then just move on. And the reason why they have all of their calves at the same time is to essentially what you would call flood the predator market. So if you were to take, let's break it down into a smaller number, you've got an area where you've got a resident pride, or you've got 2 resident prides of lions, you've got 50 wildebeest. If every week for 5 months, a female was to have a calf, that would then allow the lions to pick off 1 calf a week every week for 5 months. But if all of those females had all of their calves over 1 week, those lions would be too fat to chase anything else. They might only kill 5 of those calves. So essentially, by flooding the predatory market, yes, there's a higher risk of a lot of those calves being killed, but there's a lower risk per capita. So your chances of your offspring being the one that gets taken is significantly lower if you were to have your calves all at the same time. And then another very different thing with these animals is that they don't separate from the herd when they give birth. They give birth in the middle of the herd with everyone, because that calf is up and walking within a minute or 2, and it's running like the wind next to its mother within about 10 minutes. They are, I mean, just that whole, and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Rich, it's just, you cannot describe the sense of the migration. You have to witness it. You just can't.
It's something that just, the sounds, and to drive and drive and drive. And the Serengeti is amazing because it's almost endless plains. And when you see them on those plains, you can see for days. It just baffles the mind, and they just keep coming, and then they're coming over a ridge, and they just keep on flowing across. It's spectacular, truly spectacular. All right, so then the wildebeest says, but here's someone uglier even than me. Who can the strange looking specimen be? How do you do? I'm the spotted hyena. Who could be uglier? Who could be meaner? My mane is all spiky, my skin is all spotty. No other creature could look quite so grotty. My voice is a mix of giggles and groans, and I like nothing better than crunching on bones. I must be the ugliest beast in the scrub. Then the wildebeest shouted, hurrah, join the club. So let's talk the spotted hyena. This is one of those really misunderstood creatures, completely misunderstood. And things like the Lion King gave it a bad rap as a scavenger, which it is. It will feed off of carcasses and chase other animals off in order to get to those kills. But they are far more successful hunters than what lions are. They have about a 60% kill rate. And in doing so, and how they do so, is they actually chase their prey over long distances. It's called coursing, and they can keep up about 35 miles an hour, 30 to 35 miles an hour for about 4 to 6 miles. and they will literally just run after these wildebeest and wait and pull off the weak ones and clean up the bits. When we're talking about the Serengeti and the migration, the dominant predator is more than likely the hyena. There are registered clans where they've counted 180 individuals in one clan, in one family. And the reason why they're so successful in this place is lions have to stay put. They're territorial, they have a space. The wildebeest move out of that area. They have to wait and live off of whatever's there. So the pride can't get to 100 because there's just not enough food year round for them. There's this buffet, this abundance, this gluttony of food at little pieces. But when they're gone, it's gone. But these guys, they can move and follow these things. They have the richest milk in the animal kingdom of all of the land mammals, which is like 95% fat within that milk. So a lion will have to go back and feed its cub and give breast milk every single day. These guys can leave their cubs for up to 7 days, going in search of a meal and coming back. So you think of the distances they can cover. And because of this, they are incredibly important to the environment. They're highly social creatures. They have a very complex language, which has 12 phonetic different calls, which can be used differently to create a language. And they're the only animal we've been able to prove that can solve a problem we gave it. So very quickly, what happened was they put a cage with a pulley system that required the weight of specific hyena. They then sent in 4 hyenas, and they needed 3 specific hyenas to hang to get the combination right to lift the cage. They figured this out, and every other animal, when tested in such a way, can get to that point, like the primates can get to the point of lifting the cage, but everyone drops off and goes in. These guys work in a team. One will actually go under, pull out whatever's in there, and then the rest will drop. They then changed the combination, changed maybe a hyena, and they figured it out all over again. So the level of communication, and the spotted hyena just is an epic animal. Matt, we're going to go on to the next one.
So the leopard-faced vulture is, have we got the next bit of the story there, Rich?
Yes. But who is this hideous bird we can see perched on a branch of the powder puff tree? I'm the leopard-faced vulture. I'm ugly and bald. No wonder that everyone looks so appalled. I have flaps on my face that are wrinkled and pink. My beak is gigantic, and what's more, I stink. At mealtimes, my habits are really quite vile. I much prefer food that's been dead for a while. I'm clearly a lot more revolting than you. Then the others 2 shouted, "Bravo! Join the crew!"
So leopard-faced vultures are the biggest of the vultures that we get out here, and they are essentially the unzippers of these big carcasses. So elephants, rhinos, hippos, all of those big carcasses, that bill is needed to essentially unpluck and open up these carcasses for all of the other vultures to come through and come in. Now you can see again, not the nicest looking, not the favorite of all of the birds, and bald, completely bald, and that's because they sit with their head in carcasses all day, every day, and they can't groom. They can't groom themselves. They can't have other ones come in and groom. So they need to be able to not have any feathers on their head. And they are the cleaners of the bush. So without vultures, all of these ecosystems, all of our ecosystems across Africa would essentially fall apart. And that's because you would just have disease running rampant, going through. You would have a lot of insects that would then create more problems. They would spread diseases. And one of the, essentially, the easiest ones to pinpoint is anthrax. Now, when you have drought years, anthrax obviously can come up a little bit more often around these water holes. And when you don't have vultures that can essentially decompose that bacteria, what's going to happen? You're going to have more and more and more, and that's going to spread. Now, the biggest problem with vultures, and out of all of our vulture species, 70% of them are critically endangered. They are poached for medicinal properties. So essentially their heads are used, their beaks are used, their feathers are used, different parts of their bodies are used, all for medicinal properties. And another issue that we're having is essentially with the poaching of elephants and rhinos, a lot of these carcasses are being poisoned. So you have vultures coming in, landing, consuming the poison, and then where do they go? They go elsewhere, they spread that poison, and that causes another collapse of an ecosystem. So it is unfortunately an animal that not only doesn't look too nice, not only doesn't have a good reputation, but it's also an animal that is in dire need of conservation efforts because it is being negatively affected on all fronts. So with a rhino or an elephant, you can put a fence around it, and you can easily protect that property. But what happens with the bird? You protect that property, and then they just move to the next property. And so you can have all of the efforts in the world being put and poured into one area, and then right next door, that's not happening. And so these animals need a more contiguous and a more widespread conservation effort for everyone to be able to follow, so that we can essentially try and protect and save something that unfortunately not even a mother could love a face like this leopard-faced vulture.
So we move on to the next guy, but who is this animal having a roll in the bubbling mud of the watering hole? Hello, I'm the warthog, as ugly as sin, with 2 pairs of tusks and a bristly chin. My tail stands on end and my body is dumpy. My head is too big and my skin is too bumpy. People are shocked by my deafening snorts and my face is covered by horrible warts. I'm the worst looking creature from here to Japan. And then the other 3 shouted, "Yippee, join the clan!"
So we can't talk about African animals without talking about my favorite childhood character of Pumbaa. He is, I mean, and the new Lion King, it personifies and encapsulates the characteristic of a warthog to the T. Seth Rogen's voice is absolutely hilarious as Pumbaa. Now, Pumbaa, or as everyone knows them, the warthogs, are a fascinating creature to look at. Those warts, they're not warts like traditionally, like what we would think, like a wart on a witch's nose or anything. They're cartilaginous protrusions on the side of their face that essentially have a bony stump underneath them. Now, the male warthogs will use these to defend their eyes when they're fighting. So those tusks are protrusions of much larger teeth, much like an elephant. And they essentially are pretty much exactly the same as an elephant's tusks. A warthog has its tusks. Now, they will use those, the males will use them for fighting. So they've got those warts to protect their face. But then also there are theories behind how, very much like a bird will grow a longer tail feather, or will essentially have something that makes it difficult to function. Male warthogs are also thought that those warts, the bigger the warts, the more difficult it is to see behind or behind themselves. And so the longer those are, and if they can survive that, the stronger those genes are to carry on. Now, they usually live about 7 to 11 years, spend a lot of their time. Hobbies include mud wallowing and lying around, using the top of their nose, like the one in the top left-hand corner there. They've got this cartilaginous top of their nose that they will use to uproot and dig up bulbs and grass roots, roots of other plants. But then that's also obviously a very tough protrusion that they can use, again, defending one another, defending themselves. And females have sort of 2 to 8 piglets. Usually it's about 5 or 6, and they are probably the only cute out of all of the ugly 5. They run around like little rats in when they get disturbed, and they kind of hop and run around each other. And they have the longest gestation out of any of the hogs, any of the pigs in the world, where they gestate for 5 to 6 months. Now that variance, 5 to 6, is dependent on the size of the litter. So a smaller litter would then enable the young to be born a little bit more developed, and they would then have a shorter gestation, and then a longer gestation would be for the more of them in that litter. Now, warthogs live in abandoned aardvark burrows. So an aardvark will dig into a termite mound or dig into a patch of dirt that they would essentially want to bore out. And warthogs will then take that over and protect that as their own. Now, if you've ever seen a porcupine, porcupines will go into a warthog hole head first, or into an aardvark hole with their then quills sticking out. Whereas a warthog, the female usually goes in first to investigate, and she will then make sure everything is okay, because usually they live in sort of family groups. So you've got a female, piglets, and then the boar. Female will go in first, make sure everything's okay. Piglets will come in afterwards, and then daddy will scooch in, push his bum first, and he's got the business end of his tusk waiting for any predator that's going to come in. And their main predator obviously will be lions and leopards. Now, these guys are heavily water dependent, but the biggest problem with warthogs is because they live underground. Any year where there's a heavier than normal rainfall and those burrows will flood, they then also are susceptible to mass mortalities, because the piglets won't be able to get out of the burrow quick enough if the burrow floods before the adults will then run out as well. So in years of extreme drought or years of extreme flood, that then allows and will fluctuate in the warthog population numbers. Now, I think this is an animal. I'm going to hand over to Rich for our last one, but this is an animal that reminds me so much of boarding school. They're my teachers at boarding school. They really are. So over to you, Rich.
Great. Yeah, thanks. So the next one we're going to go to says, but who is this perfectly terrible frump raiding the rubbish bins down and by the dump? I'm the Marabou Stalk, and I think you'll agree that no other bird looks as dreadful as me. My wings are enormous, I'm hunched and I'm gangly. And look at my pouch, it's all dingly dangly. My legs are long and skinny and covered in poo, and I'll eat almost anything, even a shoe. I'm a grouchy old grump, I'm a horrible sod. And then the other 4 shouted, yoo-hoo, join the mob. So the Marabou Stalk is one of those crazy looking creatures. It has this dingly dangly, as the book says, little gular flap or pouch that's in front here, which helps them with thermoregulation, and they can expand this and contract it and have lots of blood vessels. That's why it's so pink, in order to get wind to blow past it. You can see the white on it, its legs. It actually defecates on its legs for a cooling effect and to make them white to reflect any sunlight. And these guys will sit around carcasses, they'll eat off of carcasses, but as big as they are still bottom of the queue when it comes to the actual part of getting into the carcass. The vultures will push them off. And these guys will also fish out of pools that are drying up and pull catfish out. They'll be found in dumps. They do all sorts of crazy things, but the ugliest of all of them, I think, is this guy. He looks like the Undertaker of the bush. And that sums out our ugly 5.
They they really do remind me of my teachers at boarding school. And they're grumpy. They put looks like they're walking with their arms behind their back, and they kind of walk around scolding everyone. So, I mean, yeah, they've always stuck with me as my boarding school teachers, asking questions. And so, Ted, what questions do you have for us tonight?
We, as always, have a very engaged audience here with lots of great questions. Before I dive into the first couple of them, I just want to invite anybody who's been listening to submit their questions via the question portion of the GoToWebinar portal. And we'll get to as many of them as we can. There are quite a few, so I apologize to those of you that we won't be able to get, whose questions we won't be able to get to. I also want to say that I love the Ugly Five. That book was written by the same people that wrote The Gruffalo, which is one of my kids' favorite books. So it rings true and fun for me as well. So thanks for introducing me to that. That's going to be a gift for my kids coming up. Okay, we're going to start off with the Ugly Five. You talked about the poaching of vultures, and somebody was curious. Who is it that is doing that poaching? Is that something that is prevalent in a particular country or region, or in any specific cultural or purposes otherwise?
So it's prevalent across some southern African tribes, but as far as I know, it is across Africa. And one of the theories is that consuming parts of a vulture allows you to see into the future, and I would say the medicinal poaching side of it is probably the smaller of the reasons why they're so critically endangered. The main reason is the two-part poisoning of either carcasses of animals that have been poached, so things like elephants and rhinos. If a poacher comes in and they once they're done with the carcass, they'll poison it, because then when vultures come down, even when they're fed, they won't go back up. So they'll just have this never-ending line of vultures coming down and dying on the ground. But then also, because again, as I said, they don't know, there are no boundaries for things, for creatures like this. You have you might have a game reserve and then a cattle farm. Now, this cattle farmer is sick of the jackals coming in and raiding and killing all of the young cows. He poisons that to then poison the jackal. Those jackal then die, and then the vultures come down to eat the carrion, and the vultures then die. So it's a 2 or a 3-prong issue with poaching, but the actual direct poaching of them, various tribes across Africa to consume, to then have the possibility to see into the future.
All right, thank you. Hyenas. Why is it they have gained such a bad reputation, and does that bad reputation put them at risk for endangerment in any way?
Yeah. So in many different ways, Ted, it has an impact. So even what we were talking with the poaching of vultures, the poaching of hyenas has a big part of it, because there are a lot of sangomas, our traditional healers, witch doctors, as some people might call them, will use parts of hyenas within this trade to try and cure different ailments and diseases. But basically, it's like the idea of Jaws. Steven Spielberg's Jaws gave sharks an incredibly bad reputation just because we thought that they would come out and eat us at every opportunity that there was. And the same thing was applied to the thought process around hyenas.
Yep. Great. Well, thank you for that. Staying on hyenas for a moment, one of our listeners today has shared that they saw a hyena carrying a piece of grass, a piece of grass, and he seemed to be trying to give it to other hyenas, and it was ignored. Do you happen to know what this behavior is all about? One of the pictures you had up seemed to be showing that. Does that ring a bell?
No. So this is a bone that it was actually moving around, And what will often happen at a carcass is they'll try and split off and take pieces of the carcass away if it's a big enough carcass so that they can eat in peace, or they'll even take them all the way back to the den site for the pups to start weaning off of the milk and start getting onto solids and meat.
All right.
Yeah, you'll often go to a hyena, a well-used hyena den, and it's just this scattering of bones and skulls, and they've got the most unbelievable. I mean, we had an elephant that died at Mala Mala in 2007, and I mean the sort of the pelvic plate of an elephant is probably about 2 inches thick. And when bone is wet, it's obviously a lot more hardy and more difficult to break. And this hyena just snapped off a chunk of it, chomped it all up, and then they were dragging pieces back to the den, and they'll drag entire carcasses back. And yeah, then it's just this scattering of bones all around the den.
All right. Going to the tortoises, because of climate change, are more and more leopard tortoises being born female? That was fascinating, by the way, to find that the temperature was almost deterministic in terms of the sex of the offspring. But due to climate change, are we seeing seeing trends that are related to the warming that is happening in their habitat?
I haven't read anything specific, Ted, just about tortoises, but I know crocodiles have the exact same way of breeding and using soil temperatures to determine what sex the young will come out. Actually, in crocodiles, it's the opposite way around, so the higher temperatures will be males. And what's been happening with crocodiles is as trees and things have been cleared off of riverbanks, or water levels have changed, or things like that, what you've got is this disproportionate change in that population dynamic, which could and will have a longer term effect down the line.
That makes sense.
Matt, I don't know if you've got anything you want to add to that.
Well, that's essentially so one of the prominent theories that I've read on the extinction of dinosaurs was that was the cause of their mass. It wasn't there was that event and everything died. It was that event that changed the world climate that then over millennia shifted a lot of these species to being predominantly male or predominantly female, and then their inability to reproduce. So I think now we might start seeing more and more studies going out to do those assessments and to evaluate if there has been a shift. But we will only start seeing those results because of the longevity of these animals. I mean, now crocodiles live over 100 years. You've got the old Leopard Tortoise in Madagascar and in the Seychelles that lives 120, 140 years. These Leopard Tortoises, they only get to just a bit bigger than a football helmet. They can live up to, 40, 50 years, Rich? So we'll only start then seeing the results of some of these studies probably in 30 or 40 years' time as to how those population dynamics are shifting with shifting climate change. And it's a fraction of a degree this way or that way that'll shift an entire clutch to being predominantly female or predominantly male.
Cool. Excellent. I'm gonna do 2 more questions here since we're already past time. One question is actually 2 questions combined, so really 3 questions. A couple folks want to know where one can see where one is best able to see brown hyenas as well as warthogs.
Right, so brown hyenas are generally your more arid areas, so they stick to drier areas than the spotted hyenas. Spotted hyenas are far more water dependent, so Namibia is a great place to go. There's some incredible populations, especially on some of our Namibia photographic trips up in the Hoornib, which there's a hyena researcher there, and she actually knows each individual and these guys have been known to go into seal colonies and go. And Matt was just at Madikwe. I don't know if you saw any there, Matt, but that's also a good place to see little brown.
Yeah, no, we did see them there, Madikwe. And then, yeah, warthogs pretty much anywhere where you've got water. So they don't do very well in the places that brown hyenas do very well. So you won't find them in the desert. You will find them through the Greater Kruger Park. You'll find them in most of Botswana, or northern Botswana, Moremi Game Reserve, Chobe. Most of our Botswana departures will see warthogs, and then also, funnily enough, some of the main hotels in more in areas like Livingston and Victoria Falls, places like that, because they've got these nice green lawns. You've got warthogs. We were at Madikwe, and we were actually sitting, the elephants are outside the fence, and these warthogs psych themselves up and then run through the fence so they can get to the nice green grass of the lawn. So anywhere where there's green grass and water, you're going to find warthogs.
Excellent. Okay, final question, and this is actually a rather big question, so maybe it can be a sort of scan of the species. But the question is, how are the populations of these 10 species doing overall? Are any of them particularly endangered? Any of them particularly thriving? Any comments you can make on how these species are faring in today's environment?
Matt, I'll let you start.
I would say on the whole, any wild animal is not faring particularly well in terms of overall habitat loss. So anywhere where you've got mass habitat loss, where you've got cutting off of migratory routes, luckily with the wildebeest, that has been shut down a number of times. There were lots of tenders put in for highways across the Serengeti Mara ecosystem for mining purposes, and those have been shut down several times. But I would say out of all of them, they're doing all right. The vultures are they're definitely not doing very well, and that's across the board. As I mentioned, about 70% of vulture species in Africa are critically endangered. The other 30% are just endangered. And then things like elephant shrews, very dependent on habitat fragmentation. So because they're such a small creature, but they rely on a big piece of land, because they have a high metabolic rate and they eat a lot, they are then dependent on that. They can't have fragmented habitats. So it's all well and good to have 50,000 acres that are protected, but unless those are contiguous, they don't have as much and as great an impact as they could. And one of the things that Rich and I have discussed in some of our previous webinars are these creations of these parks that cross boundaries. And we actually chatted about it on one of our WWF webinars, where it's about changing international boundaries of parks to create these big reserves and have people sharing ideas and have people doing things across boundaries that aren't necessarily, you don't have one country doing one thing and another country doing the other thing. So across the board, my opinion, I mean, I don't think any natural species is doing particularly well. There are a lot of success stories coming out, but for here, the leopard-faced vulture and the elephant shrews are probably the worst for wear, but wildebeest and warthog and things are still doing all right.
I think the point we have to remember with all of this, if we look at the bulk amount of large or mammals on the planet, and all of this comes into it, only 30% of the animals alive, large animals alive on the planet, are wild. The other 70% is domesticated. So we are literally farming our planet to death. So whilst we look at all of these things and discuss their stories and see how they're going, our impact has been for millennia and will continue until we start seeing the value in it. And as Matt says, create these parks that will sustain and allow migratory routes, allow things to move back, but also we don't know how much of an impact we've had going forward.
Thank you, gentlemen. With that, I think I'm going to wrap things up here. It was really such a treat to have you both with us here today, as always. My thanks as well to everyone who joined us. Please be sure to join us later this week and into next week and beyond for future Daily Dose of Nature presentations. We did record today's presentation, and that replay will be available on our website soon, as well as emailed to you, thanks to your registration. So with that, I'm going to conclude our webinar. Thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.